I'm not even sure where to start. This happened a couple of years ago, maybe 3. I don't remember the time of year, but I do remember it was freezing. I grew up in a small seaside town. My house was on the edge of it, completely isolated. The closest neighbor was half a kilometer away, and the place was surrounded by dense woods with trails that eventually opened up into fields. I walked those trails every day with my German Shepherd, Micho. Micho's huge. I'm 6 feet 2 inches, and when he jumps, he can reach my face. He's always been a big comfort for me when walking at night. If there was anything out there, I knew Micho would scare it off. This one night, though, made me question everything. We'd gone for our usual walk. It was pitch black, and my phone battery was almost dead, maybe 4% left. I had Micho's light-up collar to guide me, but eventually I had to turn on my flashlight just to make sure I stayed on the trail. I figured I could make it back before my phone died. About halfway back, Micho suddenly froze. He was staring into the woods, and before I could figure out what he saw, he started barking like crazy. Not his usual bark either. This was aggressive, like he wanted to fight whatever was out there. He yanked so hard on his leash that I almost lost my grip. I tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't stop. Then I heard movement in the trees. At first I thought it was a deer or maybe a fox, but it sounded heavier. Whatever it was, it wasn't small. And then I heard a howl. It wasn't like any howl I'd ever heard. It sounded distorted, almost like someone screaming through a broken speaker. The sound froze me in place. Micho started growling, pulling at the leash again, and that snapped me out of it. I decided it was time to go. We started walking fast, almost running, but I could hear footsteps behind us. At first, I thought it might be a person trying to mess with me, but the steps were too fast and uneven, like whoever or whatever it was couldn't walk properly. My phone battery dropped to 1%. I knew I shouldn't, but I turned around and used the flashlight. I wish I hadn't. What I saw didn't make sense. It was tall, way taller than me, but it was hunched over. Its limbs were freakishly long, its skin looked rotten and stretched tight over its bones, and it moved in this awful way, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on all 4s. But what froze me was its face. It looked like Micho. Not just similar, it was an exact copy. Same markings, same shape, even the same glowing collar. But the eyes were all wrong. They were wide, empty, and glowing faintly, like they weren't even real. I didn't stop to think. I ran harder than I ever have in my life, with Micho right by my side. We made it home, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with a knife, listening for any sound outside. Micho seemed fine after a while. He went back to his bed and slept like nothing had happened, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I still walk those trails, but only during the day. Even then, I feel like something's watching me, and sometimes when I look at Micho, I can't shake the feeling that maybe it's not really him. This didn't happen to me, but to a very close friend of mine. I've heard a lot about coyotes and skinwalkers over the years, but my own experiences have been pretty tame. Weird? Yeah. Creepy? Absolutely. But nothing paranormal or out of the ordinary, at least not until I heard Patrick's story. After that, I couldn't bring myself to go back to a favorite spot in the backcountry. We'd been friends for a long time, always meeting up for trips into the woods or down to remote camping spots. The kind of places most people would never think to look for, let alone go to. Patrick was always the more seasoned camper. He knew his way around the wilderness, always had a cool head when things went wrong, and had a sort of quiet confidence about him. I trusted his judgment. So when he told me what happened, I had to take him seriously. The story starts with one of Patrick's solo camping trips. He'd been out at this secret spot he loved way out in the backcountry, an area most people wouldn't even think to visit. It wasn't near any main trails or campsites, just miles of open land and dense forest. Patrick had been out there for a couple of days, just enjoying the peace and solitude, when he started noticing something strange. It was a coyote. At first, Patrick didn't think much of it. He saw coyotes all the time out there, but there was always something about this one that stood out. It wasn't like the other coyotes he'd seen. This one seemed to always be around, following him, but never overtly. It was like it stayed just out of sight, always on the edge of his vision. He'd spot it briefly between the trees, or just past his peripheral vision, but when he turned to look, it'd vanish. It happened again the next day, and then again, but it wasn't until he was leaving the area that things started getting weird. Patrick had packed up his gear and loaded his truck, ready to head back down the wash and onto the fire road that led back to the highway. It was early in the morning, still dark enough that the sun hadn't fully risen yet, but he was anxious to get out of there. The feeling that something was off had been with him the whole time he'd been camping, but it had been creeping up on him more that morning. He started driving down the wash, his tires crunching on the gravel, his headlights cutting through the early morning fog. At the end of the wash, he could see the coyote again. This time, it wasn't just lurking on the edge of his vision. It was clear, just behind the trees, walking at the same pace as his truck. Patrick didn't know what to make of it at first. Maybe it was just a wild animal, following the sound of his truck. But as he drove further down the wash, he saw it again, keeping pace with him, and this time it was running alongside the truck. Now Patrick was freaked out. He hit the gas, speeding up to around 35 miles per hour, thinking that might be enough to outrun a coyote. But it wasn't. The coyote just kept running. It was impossible. He could see it now, clearly enough to make out its details. The animal wasn't just fast, it was matching the truck's speed. There was no way a coyote could run that fast for that long, especially not on rough terrain like this. Patrick's heart started pounding in his chest. He glanced in the side mirror, trying to get a better look, and that's when it happened. The coyote wasn't a coyote anymore. It was running on two legs, and it wasn't just any coyote now, it was a person. It was like a man, but the skin was wrong, stretched too tight, covered in what looked like the fur of a coyote, wrapped around the shoulders, the legs. It was wearing what Patrick described as buckskin pants. The creature didn't break stride, just kept running alongside the truck, keeping pace as if it was some kind of twisted race. Patrick's stomach dropped. He couldn't make sense of it. His brain kept trying to put together the pieces, but nothing made any sense. Was this some kind of prank? But how could anyone be running that fast, dressed like that in the middle of nowhere? He glanced back once more, and just like that, the figure was gone. Gone. Patrick slammed on the brakes. He pulled over to the side of the road, hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying to catch his breath. His mind was racing, but no matter how many times he tried to piece it together, nothing explained what he'd just seen. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty stretch of road. Finally, he started driving again. This time, he didn't look back. When he got home, Patrick didn't say much about it. He went on about his trip like he always did, telling me about the views, the camping, the trails he'd hiked. But there was something off in his eyes, something different about the way he carried himself. He was quieter than usual. I figured it was just exhaustion from the trip, maybe a little too much time alone out there. It wasn't until a few days later that he told me the whole story, and when he did, he didn't look me in the eye. He just kept looking down, like he couldn't shake what had happened. "I don't know what it was," he said, "but I know what I saw." I believed him. We never went back to that grove after that. I mean, I'd been there plenty of times before, but hearing what happened to Patrick kept me away. Something about that area didn't sit right anymore. The way he described the creature, the way it was able to keep pace with him and then just disappear. It wasn't something a coyote could do. It wasn't something a person could do either. It made me think about all the weird stories I'd heard over the years, the ones about coyotes and skinwalkers, all the strange things that are whispered about in the backcountry, the things that people joke about until they experience it for themselves. I'd heard people say that skinwalkers can take on the form of animals, coyotes, wolves, bears, but I never really took it seriously until now. Patrick never went back either. I think he wanted to, but something inside him told him it wasn't safe, and I felt the same way. Sometimes I still wonder about that coyote, about what it really was. Was it a skinwalker, as Patrick seemed to think, or something else entirely? But I know one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't something I ever want to encounter. Not out there, not in the middle of nowhere, where anything could be lurking just beyond the trees, waiting for you to look away for just a second. And as much as I want to go back to that grove, I don't think I'll ever be able to. Not after hearing Patrick's story. My grandmother on my mom's side was always different. She wasn't religious, but she was deeply superstitious, and I always got the feeling she believed in things most people wouldn't even dream of. Her mother was full-blooded Navajo, and her father was Irish. She grew up in Nevada in a small isolated town and never ventured farther east than Montana. Growing up, I heard bits and pieces of her family's old stories, things about the land and the spirits that lived there, but she never liked to talk about them much. The one thing she would mention every now and then was the Yinaldlushi. When I was in grade school, we went to visit her one summer. It was a typical visit, at first boring old people stuff, the kind of thing you expect when you're a kid. But there was one thing that was off. My grandma kept all her curtains shut, not just during the night, but all day long. It was always dark inside her house, and she didn't let anyone open the windows. Every once in a while, she'd peek out the curtains, looking over her shoulder, like she expected someone or something to be watching her. When we asked her why she was so secretive, she'd always answer in the same way, like it was a matter of fact. The Yinaldlushi is watching me. I had no idea what that meant at the time, but it unsettled me. I'd heard her say it enough times to know she wasn't joking, but she never explained. Things got even weirder as the visit went on. She wouldn't let us go near certain areas of her property. She wouldn't even let us walk around the house at night. Whenever we tried to ask her about it, she'd change the subject or give us a strange look. It was like she was afraid of something out there. Then came the evening we'll never forget. It was a few days before we were supposed to leave, and we were all outside, my grandma, my little brother, and me. We were in the front yard, just hanging out, when my grandma suddenly screamed my brother's name. She was screaming, but I could hear the terror in her voice. "Get away from that creature. It's not safe." We all ran outside, thinking maybe he'd found a scorpion or a rattlesnake, but the scene we walked into was far worse than anything I could have imagined. My grandmother was standing against the side of the house, holding my brother tightly to her chest, her face pale and terrified. I had never seen her like this. Standing in the yard, just a few feet away, was a deer, but not just any deer. This one was huge, easily the size of a horse. Its antlers were twisted and unnatural, like they were warped into strange, jagged shapes. But it wasn't the antlers that made me freeze in place. It was its eyes. Its eyes were wide, glowing yellow. almost too bright, like they were reflecting something deeper. And it wasn't looking at my brother or me, it was staring directly at my grandmother. The gaze was so intense, it felt like it was searching her, studying her. We didn't move. We just stood there, watching as the deer tilted its head slowly, almost like it was understanding something about her. Then without warning, it snorted, took a step back, and bolted into the darkness. Its movements were jerky, almost like it wasn't sure whether to run on 4 legs or 2. I couldn't tell if it was unnaturally fast, or if it was just the shock of seeing it that made it seem that way. My grandmother didn't move for a long time. She was shaking, clutching my brother tighter than before. When we finally asked her what had happened, all she could say was, "The Yanald Lushi has found me." She said it over and over, her voice trembling. I still didn't understand. I just thought she was frightened by the strange deer. But my grandmother was serious. She said the creature was a skinwalker, a shapeshifter from Navajo legend. She explained that they can take the form of animals or even people, but always with something wrong about them. The eyes, she said, were the biggest sign. If you saw those eyes, it meant the skinwalker had targeted you. We left a few days later, but my grandma never settled down after that. She packed up and moved away from that place soon after. She wouldn't tell anyone where she went, just that she couldn't stay anymore. She had lived on that land for decades, but after that night, she didn't feel safe there anymore. Even now, I can't shake the memory of that deer. It wasn't a normal deer. It couldn't have been. The way it stood there, staring at my grandma, with those glowing eyes, it wasn't just an animal. I really hope my grandma feels more safe now that she moved out, and wished I had believed her. You never believe those things until you see them. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, let me know by leaving a comment below. Your feedback helps me create more content you'll love. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more updates. See you in the next video.